Does anyone have any questions or any comments about anything? Yes, ma'am.
It's wonderful to see you again, looking so well, so healthy. I have to comment that I've been reading your books for decades, since the 60s, and it just amazes me how prolific you are. Have you ever hit a wall?
Can you all hear this? It's a question. I've often asked this question about, do I have a kind of writer's block? Well, I think we all do. You know, there are things you can't always write about that you're not ready to write about. But if you keep on taking notes and thinking about it, then you'll be able to work on it. The hardest thing to write is a novel. Before you can begin a novel, you have to amass a lot of notes and maybe an outline or a couple of outlines, and you have to do a lot of preliminary work with a novel. A short story, maybe you could sit down and write it in a white hot burst of energy or something. But a novel really demands a different kind of thinking and then the imagination. So if you're not ready to write the novel, you hit the wall, or whatever you said. You can't really do it yet. I think it's analogous to making a movie. You know, movies are filmed in a certain number of days, but before that, they are in pre-production. And pre-production can be anywhere from a year to 10 years. It can be a long time. The pre-production before the movie is so important. You can never make a movie without pre-production, and I think the same thing is true with a novel. The reason I wrote the memoir, I didn't really write the memoir, I couldn't write. I was not able to write with much facility. After my husband died, I could, however, take notes in my journal, and it was like a lifeline. And I remember thinking that it's like breathing through a straw where the straw is all bent and not very effective, but if you try, you can breathe. And I thought of this journal as some sort of a straw, and that the act of writing was some way of keeping going, keeping alive. But the journal is the easiest kind of writing because it's just for you. And at night, I couldn't sleep, so I would lie in my bed, and I just write down what happened that day, without any comment. I didn't have to say that I was in a state of grief or whatever. I just write down what happened. And day after day, night after night, even though I didn't intend it, it added up to something. So if you're not able to write, you can always do a journal. And so I think that's really a new idea for me. It was kind of a new idea, because I usually write in a more directed and conscious way. This was sort of half unconscious.
Have you always written a journal, or did this just start after Ray died?
No, I've always written a journal, but it's not so impressionistically. A journal is also like a diary. You know, you can say what you met somebody, you did some things that day. It's good to have that record. This is more impressionistic, lots of dashes and lots of writing that was right from the heart. And so that then I assembled that into the memoir with a little revision and wrote 2 or 3 real chapters that are like background. So it wasn't that hard. It wasn't that hard to do, oddly enough. It was hard to live it. But then it wasn't hard to put it together.
Have you used journals to write other autobiographical works and first-person accounts?
Well, you know, funny thing is, I have sometimes. I've written a couple of stories just for Otto. Otto said he's editing an anthology of certain kind of stories, like with theme of boxing, let's say, or horse racing. And I wrote back to Otto and I said, oh, I can't do that. It's like telling me what to dream. But then later on, I got an idea which was provided by the suggestion, not directly, but kind of indirectly. So we can direct dreams, sort of. And then some of those things I would write in a journal, and then they eventually evolved into short stories. But it's kind of interesting because if you hadn't told me to write the story, I might not have written it, even though when I wrote it, it got very, very personal, especially the one about Roland Lastarza.
The man who fought Roland Lastarza.
Yeah, it became one of my very favorite stories of my own. And I had a whole lot of material from my background, and my father had gone to boxing matches and so forth. But if Otto hadn't stirred that, it wouldn't have happened. So that's what's wonderful about, well, first of all about Otto, but also about working with some editors who give you ideas.
I'm glad you wrote that story because it's one of the best stories you've ever written, I think.
I love it too, and people like it. And it doesn't have necessarily a bad ending. I mean, it's a tragic story, but it's... Anyway, give me some more ideas.
I'll see you later.
Yeah.
That story read like you were a scholar of boxing. Had you actually studied it?
Oh, I didn't know. I didn't study boxing. My
I
father
meant, well,
went to boxing matches when he was a young man and I was a child. And I went with him, and we went to boxing matches in Buffalo, New York. And almost nobody's ever even heard of Roland Lastarza now. But he was a pretty good heavyweight boxer around the time that Rocky Marciano was the champion. He just wasn't quite as good as Marciano. That's the problem.
Joyce, by the way, Joyce wrote a book called On Boxing,
Yes.
which
yes.
is based on a piece that you wrote for Esquire, was it? Or
Well,
GQ? Or
I wrote something for Life magazine.
was it? Okay.
Yeah, Life magazine, yeah.
Yeah, and somebody important who I've now forgotten because I forget everything, said it was the best sports book that anyone has ever written about any sport.
Wow, who's that person?
And if I could remember, I would. It could have been somebody like Norman Mailer.
Well, Norman can't object. So I was going to say, when Norman Mailer introduced me at a large event, it was a fundraiser, he said, here's somebody who wrote a book on boxing. It's so good I thought I'd written it myself. And you know, he was so funny. He was really sweet. His egotism was just so innocent. Yeah. Well, I've thought of boxing as it's a fantastically fascinating entity, but it's also a metaphor. And I think we're drawn to the entity itself because it's a performance that's so extraordinary. But then some of us who are writers are drawn to it because it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor also. It has two. I'm not sure that all sports have that. I mean, watching men play golf or watching people play golf, for some people that's exciting, but not for me. You know, it's somehow not.
It's a game, not a sport.
It's a game,
Yeah.
that's right. I don't think of boxing as a sport, though. I thought when I knew Mike Tyson, he was the boxer whom I knew most, and I wrote on about Mike quite a bit. Mike said he didn't think of boxing as a sport. It's like gladiatorial combat, and you know he is not an unintelligent person. He's gotten a lot of bad press, but when I knew him, he was pretty intelligent. And he would come up with things like that, like the ancient Roman gladiatorial combat. That's really what it's like, and that's not a sport. You're in there to live or die.
Yeah.